The bright yellow boot clamped onto my Ford F350's front wheel gleamed in the morning sun like a trophy of Karen's victory. She stood there in her pristine white tennis outfit, hands on her hips, watching two uniformed tow truck drivers prepare the massive chains that would drag my ranch truck away from my own driveway. "I warned you, Jake," she called out with that saccharine smile that made my skin crawl. Oversized commercial vehicles are strictly prohibited in Meadowbrook Estates. Maybe next time you'll think twice before ignoring HOA regulations. What Karen Morrison didn't know, what none of the smirking HOA board members standing behind her knew, was that those two tow truck drivers worked for me. The entire fleet of vehicles lined up on my street belonged to my company. And in about 30 seconds, Karen was going to learn the most expensive lesson of her perfectly manicured life. But let me back up 6 months, because this story starts with a handshake and a lie. I'd bought the house at 1247 Maple Ridge Drive in January, drawn by the spacious 3-car garage and the quarter-acre lot that would give me room to park my work truck without bothering anyone. The realtor, Sandra Webb, had assured me that the HOA was very reasonable and that commercial vehicles were allowed as long as they were properly maintained and not used for active business operations on the property. I should have gotten that in writing. My name is Jake Morrison, no relation to Karen, despite the unfortunate shared last name, and I own Morrison Recovery Services, the largest towing and vehicle recovery company in the county. What started as a single tow truck and a lot of determination had grown into a fleet of 18 vehicles, from light-duty wreckers to massive rotators that could lift fully loaded semi-trucks. The irony wasn't lost on me that I made my living helping people in their worst automotive moments, while living in a community that seemed dedicated to creating those moments. The first sign of trouble came 3 weeks after I moved in. I was washing my F350 in the driveway, a perfectly normal Saturday morning activity, when Karen materialized beside my truck like she'd been summoned from some HOA hell dimension. "Excuse me," she said, not bothering with introductions, "but I need to inform you that commercial vehicles are not permitted in residential driveways overnight." I looked up from scrubbing road salt off my bumper, genuinely confused. "I'm sorry, what?" "This is my personal truck." Karen's laugh could have shattered windows. "Personal truck? Mr. Morrison, is it? That vehicle is clearly marked as commercial. It has running lights, a heavy-duty suspension, and a Class 5 trailer hitch. Those are commercial specifications." She was right about the specs, but wrong about everything else. "This is my personal vehicle that I use to tow my boat and haul supplies from my ranch property. It's not a commercial vehicle." "The HOA covenants are very clear," Karen continued, pulling out her phone to take photos of my truck from multiple angles. "Any vehicle with a gross weight rating over 8,500 pounds is classified as commercial, regardless of its intended use." That's when I realized Sandra, the realtor, had either lied to me or didn't understand the HOA rules herself. Either way, I was now living in a community that considered my daily driver a commercial vehicle subject to restrictions I'd never agreed to. Karen handed me a violation notice that looked like it had been printed on official government letterhead. "You have 48 hours to relocate this vehicle to an appropriate commercial storage facility. Continued violations will result in towing at the owner's expense." As she walked away, her tennis shoes making no sound on the pristine sidewalk, I made my first mistake. I decided to be reasonable. I called the HOA management company and explained the situation. My truck was registered as a personal vehicle, insured as a personal vehicle, and used exclusively for personal purposes when I wasn't at work. Surely there was some accommodation for residents who needed heavier vehicles for legitimate personal use. The property manager, a tired-sounding woman named Linda, put me on hold for 10 minutes before coming back with bad news. "Mr. Morrison, The covenants are very specific about vehicle weight limits. However, you can apply for a variance through the Architectural Review Board. The next meeting is in 6 weeks. 6 weeks of parking my truck off property while Karen got to feel victorious? That wasn't going to work. Over the next month, Karen escalated her campaign against my truck with the dedication of a general planning a siege. She started timing my comings and goings, photographing my truck every time I parked it in my driveway. She recruited other HOA board members to patrol the neighborhood and document violations. But Karen's masterpiece was the anonymous complaint she filed with the county zoning office, claiming I was operating a commercial trucking business out of my residence. That triggered an inspection that cost me a day off work and hundreds of dollars in legal fees to prove that my home-based business office had nothing to do with truck storage. The county inspector, a guy named Rick, who clearly had better things to do, took one look at my setup and shook his head. Someone's obviously trying to cause you trouble. Your home office is completely legitimate, and there's no evidence of commercial vehicle operations here. But Rick's visit gave me an idea that would change everything. Just out of curiosity, I asked him, what would happen if someone was actually operating a towing business without proper permits? Rick's expression got serious. That's a big deal. Unlicensed towing is a felony in this county. We've been cracking down hard because of all the predatory operators who've been scamming people. That conversation planted a seed that would grow into Karen's downfall. The harassment continued to escalate. Karen convinced the HOA to hire security patrols, basically her retired friends, driving around in golf carts with clipboards, looking for violations. They started citing me for everything imaginable: parking my truck 1 inch over my property line, washing it during quiet hours, even having it visible from the street during HOA-designated aesthetic maintenance periods. Each violation came with a fine: $25 for minor infractions, $50 for major ones, and $100 for repeat offenses. Karen had created a system where she could essentially tax me for owning a vehicle she didn't like. But the breaking point came on a Tuesday in April. I'd been working a particularly difficult recovery, a jackknifed semi on the interstate that had taken 6 hours to clear, and I came home, exhausted, at 11 p.m. I parked my truck in my driveway, same as always, and dragged myself inside for a shower and some sleep. At 6 a.m., I woke up to the sound of diesel engines and backup alarms. I stumbled outside in my bathrobe to find Karen directing a convoy of official-looking vehicles. 2 tow trucks, a flatbed trailer, and a van marked HOA Enforcement Services were positioned around my F-350 like wolves surrounding prey. "Good morning, Jake," Karen called out cheerfully. "I hope you slept well because your truck is about to take a little trip." That's when I noticed the boot clamped onto my front wheel and the chains being attached to my rear axle. "What the hell is this?" I demanded. Karen consulted her clipboard like she was reading from a script. After repeated violations and non-payment of fines totaling $847.50, the HOA has authorized immediate vehicle impoundment. Your truck will be held at a secure facility until all fines are paid and you provide written assurance that future violations will not occur. The lead tow truck driver, a guy wearing a uniform that looked suspiciously new, approached with paperwork. "Sir, I need you to sign this impoundment authorization." "I'm not signing anything," I said. "This is my property, and you can't just take my truck." Karen's smile got wider. "Actually, we can. The HOA covenants you signed give us authority to remove any vehicle that poses a continuing violation of community standards. This is all perfectly legal." That's when I noticed something that made my blood run cold. The tow trucks weren't marked with any company name I recognized. The uniforms were generic, and the paperwork the driver was holding had spelling errors and formatting that looked like it had been created on someone's home computer. Who exactly are you people? I asked. The lead driver shifted uncomfortably. We're, contracted through the HOA's enforcement company. What company? Karen stepped forward quickly. That's not your concern, Jake. You had your chance to comply voluntarily. But I was already putting the pieces together. The generic uniforms, the suspicious paperwork, the fact that no legitimate towing company would attempt to impound a vehicle from private property without a court order or police involvement. Karen had hired someone to steal my truck. In that moment, standing in my bathrobe, watching criminals prepare to steal my property while my HOA president supervised, I realized that reasonable solutions were off the table. Karen had escalated beyond annoying neighbor disputes into actual criminal activity. Time to show her what a real towing operation looked like. Gentlemen, I said calmly, walking back toward my house, I need to make a quick phone call before you proceed. Karen practically vibrated with excitement. Call whoever you want, Jake. But that truck is leaving this morning. I smiled for the first time in months. Oh, it's definitely leaving. Just not the way you think. 5 minutes later, the sound of approaching diesel engines announced the arrival of my cavalry. Karen's confident expression shifted to confusion as she watched 3 massive tow trucks turn onto our quiet suburban street. These weren't the cheap, unmarked vehicles Karen had hired. These were professional heavy-duty wreckers with MORRISO, NRECOVER, YSERV, ICAIS emblazoned across their sides in bold lettering. Behind them came a flatbed trailer, a service van, and my personal favorite Bertha, our 75-ton rotator that could lift a city bus. The cavalry was led by Tommy Rodriguez, my operations manager and the most competent recovery specialist in the county. He'd been with me for 8 years, and I'd never seen him fail to handle a difficult situation. Tommy stepped out of the lead truck, wearing his official Morrison recovery uniform, the real kind, with proper company logos, certifications, and identification. He surveyed Karen's amateur towing operation, like a professional inspector examining counterfeit merchandise. "Morning, boss," Tommy said, touching the brim of his cap. "Looks like you've got some unlicensed operators working your neighborhood." Karen's face went pale. "Licensed? What do you mean, licensed?" That's when I decided it was time for introductions. "Karen, I'd like you to meet Tommy Rodriguez, operations manager for Morrison Recovery Services." "Tommy, this is Karen Morrison, HOA president, and apparently the coordinator of an unlicensed towing operation." The transformation in Karen's expression was magnificent. Confusion melted into understanding, which quickly turned to absolute terror as she realized the magnitude of her mistake. You own a towing company?" she whispered. "Not just any towing company," I replied. "The largest vehicle recovery service in the county. We have contracts with the state police, the sheriff's department, and about half the auto dealerships in the region." Tommy was already documenting the scene with his camera, photographing the unmarked vehicles and their fake paperwork. "Boss, you want me to call the sheriff about this unlicensed operation?" "In a minute," I said. "First, I want to give our visitors a chance to explain who hired them to steal my truck." The lead fake driver was already backing away from my F-350, clearly realizing he'd walked into something much bigger than a simple vehicle impound. "Look, man, we were just doing what the lady paid us to do." "The lady paid you to commit grand theft auto," Tommy pointed out helpfully. "That's a felony." Karen finally found her voice. This is perfectly legal. The HOA has authority to issue fines and file liens," I interrupted. "You do not have authority to hire unlicensed criminals to steal residents' vehicles. That's about 6 different felonies, including conspiracy to commit theft." The fake tow truck drivers were already loading their equipment back onto their trucks, clearly wanting to be anywhere else. "Lady, you didn't tell us this guy was in the business," one of them called out to Karen. "Wait!" Karen screamed. "You can't just leave. I paid you already." "You paid them to commit crimes on your behalf," Tommy said, still taking photos. "I've got their license plates, their faces, and audio recording of them admitting they were paid to steal a vehicle. This is going to be an interesting police report." That's when the other HOA board members who had come to watch my humiliation started quietly slipping away. Nobody wanted to be associated with Karen's criminal towing scheme when the police arrived. But I wasn't done with my revenge yet. Not even close. "Tommy," I said, "I think our trucks need some maintenance. Why don't you park them here in the neighborhood while we inspect them for safety violations?" Tommy's grin was evil. "Great idea, boss. Safety first." Over the next hour, my crew strategically positioned our entire fleet throughout Meadowbrook Estates. Massive tow trucks parked legally on every public street, their diesel engines idling, backup alarms beeping regularly as drivers performed routine safety check. The psychological effect was immediate and devastating. Every HOA resident who looked out their window saw professional towing equipment everywhere, operated by uniformed crews who clearly knew what they were doing. After months of Karen threatening everyone with towing for minor violations, the neighborhood was suddenly full of actual tow trucks. My phone started ringing immediately. "Jake, this is Bill Henderson from 1425 Maple Ridge. Listen, I may have been a little hasty supporting Karen's vehicle restrictions. Is there any chance we could work something out?" Then Linda Peterson from across the street. "Jake, I want to apologize for not speaking up earlier. That business with your truck was completely unfair." Within 2 hours, I had calls from 7 HOA board members, all suddenly eager to discuss reasonable accommodations for residents with legitimate needs for larger vehicles. But the best call came from the county sheriff's office. "Mr. Morrison, this is Deputy Sarah Chen. We've received a complaint about unlicensed towing operators in your neighborhood. Since you're our primary recovery contractor, we wanted to coordinate with you on the investigation." I provided Deputy Chen with all the documentation Tommy had gathered, including audio recordings of the fake drivers admitting they'd been hired to steal my truck. The deputy was particularly interested in Karen's role in organizing the criminal operation. "Conspiracy to commit grand theft auto is serious business," Deputy Chen explained. "If someone hired unlicensed operators to impound vehicles without legal authority, they're looking at felony charges." The arrest happened 3 days later. I was working in my garage when I heard the commotion outside. Through my window, I watched Karen being led away in handcuffs, while her neighbors stood in their yards, jaws hanging open in disbelief. The charges were impressive: conspiracy to commit theft, fraud, operating an unlicensed business, and about half a dozen other felonies related to her fake towing scheme. The investigation had revealed that Karen had been planning to expand her operation, targeting other residents with vehicles she considered inappropriate for the neighborhood. But the criminal charges were just the beginning of Karen's problems. The civil lawsuit came 2 weeks later. Not from me, though. My attorney was preparing that paperwork, but from the fake towing company Karen had hired. Turns out, when you hire criminals to commit crimes, and then those criminals get arrested because of your incompetence, they're not happy about it. Karen's co-conspirators were claiming she'd misrepresented the legality of the operation, promising them it was a legitimate HOA enforcement action. Now they were facing felony charges because of her lies, and they wanted compensation for their legal fees and lost income. The HOA itself was also in serious trouble. The management company that oversaw Meadowbrook Estates immediately terminated their contract, citing Karen's unauthorized actions and the criminal liability she'd created for the association. Insurance companies started asking difficult questions about coverage, for criminal acts committed by board members. Property values in Meadowbrook Estates dropped 15% almost overnight as news of the scandal spread. Real estate agents were having to explain to potential buyers why the HOA president had been arrested for trying to steal residents' cars. But my favorite consequence was what happened to Karen's house. 3 weeks after her arrest, while Karen was out on bail and trying to find a lawyer who would take her case, she came home to find a bright yellow boot clamped onto her Mercedes SUV. The uniformed deputy standing beside her vehicle was holding official paperwork from the county sheriff's office. "Ma'am, this vehicle has been impounded pending resolution of criminal charges related to fraud and theft. You'll need to contact the district attorney's office to arrange for its release." Karen's screams of outrage could be heard 3 blocks away. The irony was perfect. The woman who had terrorized the neighborhood with threats of vehicle impoundment was now experiencing legitimate vehicle impoundment as a consequence of her criminal actions. But the story gets even better. Karen's legal troubles opened floodgates of complaints from other residents who had been victims of her HOA tyranny. It turned out that the fake towing scheme was just the latest escalation in years of harassment, intimidation, and abuse of power. Margaret Kim from Elm Street filed a complaint about Karen, forcing her to repaint her house 3 times because the color was allegedly not approved, despite being identical to the color on her original architectural approval. Robert Chen documented how Karen had fined him $500 for installing a mailbox that was 1 inch taller than specifications, then demanded he hire a specific contractor, her brother-in-law, to fix the violation. Linda Rodriguez revealed that Karen had been operating a protection racket, offering to waive violations and reduce fines for residents who hired her husband's landscaping company for their yard maintenance. The pattern was clear. Karen had been using her HOA position to run various scams and intimidation schemes throughout the neighborhood. My truck situation had just been the most visible example of her criminal behavior. The State Attorney General's office opened a formal investigation into HOA abuse, using Meadowbrook Estates as a case study. The investigation revealed systematic corruption involving multiple board members and contractors connected to Karen's family. Within 6 months, the entire HOA structure at Meadowbrook Estates had collapsed. The management company faced lawsuits from residents demanding refunds of improperly collected fines. The Architectural Review Board was dissolved after investigators found evidence of kickback schemes involving preferred contractors. Karen herself faced a choice between accepting a plea deal that would send her to prison for 18 months or going to trial on felony charges that could result in 5 years behind bars. She took the plea deal. The day Karen was sentenced, I was working a recovery job on the interstate when Tommy called with an update from the courthouse. "Boss, she got 18 months plus 3 years probation. Has to pay restitution to everyone she scammed, and she's banned from serving on any HOA board for 10 years. But the best part was still coming. Karen's house went up for sale 2 weeks after her sentencing. The legal fees, restitution payments, and loss of her husband's income. He'd been fired when his employer learned about his connection to the HOA corruption had bankrupted the family. The listing agent was brutally honest in the property description. Beautiful home in transitioning neighborhood. Previous HOA dissolved due to criminal activity. New community governance structure being developed. The house sold for 30% below its previous market value. 6 months later, Meadowbrook Estates had been completely transformed. The new community association was run by residents who actually lived in the neighborhood, not power-hungry tyrants looking to scam their neighbors. The architectural guidelines were streamlined and reasonable. The vehicle restrictions were eliminated entirely. Property values recovered and actually exceeded their previous levels as word spread about the reformed community that had successfully eliminated HOA corruption. My F-350 sits in my driveway every night now, clean and well-maintained, just like always. But sometimes, when I'm washing it on Saturday mornings, new neighbors stop by to chat and ask about the truck. They've heard the story of how one resident's vehicle became the catalyst for exposing criminal corruption in their community. I always tell them the same thing my grandfather taught me about bullies. The best way to deal with someone who abuses power is to make sure they face the consequences of their actions. Karen thought she could intimidate me because she had authority and I was just one guy with a truck. She never imagined that one guy with a truck might also own the largest fleet of trucks in the county, complete with the legal knowledge, professional connections, and resources needed to turn her criminal scheme against her. These days, when I drive through neighborhoods and see residents dealing with petty HOA tyrants, I make sure to leave my business cards at local coffee shops and community centers. Morrison Recovery Services has become known for more than just towing broken-down vehicles. We're also specialists in recovering communities from broken-down leadership. Karen Morrison, no relation, learned the hard way that sometimes the person you're trying to intimidate has exactly the skills and resources needed to expose your crimes and destroy your life. And sometimes, the best revenge is simply letting criminals hang themselves with their own illegal schemes while you document everything for the authorities. Next week, I'll tell you about the time an HOA in Pine Valley hired fake code enforcement officers to harass residents and how we caught them using GPS tracking and hidden cameras. But that's a story that's still making headlines in 3 counties. But Karen's story didn't end with her prison sentence. What happened next turned our local HOA scandal into a cautionary tale that would be studied by community associations across the entire state. 3 months into Karen's 18-month sentence, I got a call that chilled me to the bone. It was from Detective Sarah Chen, the same deputy who had handled Karen's arrest, but she was calling about something much bigger than HOA corruption. "Jake, we need to talk," she said. "Can you meet me at your office? And bring your records from the Meadowbrook investigation. All of them." When Detective Chen walked into Morrison Recovery Services that Tuesday afternoon, she wasn't alone. Behind her came 2 FBI agents, a state attorney general investigator, and a woman I didn't recognize carrying a briefcase that looked like it weighed 50 pounds. "Mr. Morrison," Detective Chen began, "what we're about to tell you is going to sound unbelievable, but we need your help to stop something that makes Karen's crimes look like petty theft." The woman with the briefcase introduced herself as Agent Patricia Walsh from the Federal Bureau of Investigation's White Collar Crime Division. She opened that heavy briefcase and pulled out file folders that were 3 inches thick. Karen Morrison's fake towing scheme wasn't an isolated incident, Agent Walsh explained. It was part of a nationwide network of HOA-based criminal enterprises that we've been tracking for 2 years. The scope was staggering. Over 40 HOA communities across 12 states had been infiltrated by criminal organizations using tactics identical to what Karen had deployed against me. Fake towing operations, kickback schemes with contractors, protection rackets involving landscaping and maintenance companies, and systematic harassment designed to force residents to sell their properties below market value. The properties were being purchased by shell companies connected to organized crime, Agent Walsh continued. They were essentially using HOA corruption to conduct real estate fraud on a massive scale. But here's the part that made my blood run cold. Karen hadn't been the mastermind. She'd been recruited by someone much more dangerous. The investigation had started when the FBI noticed patterns in property transfers around HOA communities that had experienced management problems. Dozens of homes were being sold at significant losses after residents were harassed by corrupt board members, then immediately resold to legitimate buyers at full market value. The profits were going to a network of criminal organizations that specialized in real estate manipulation. They would identify vulnerable HOA communities, recruit corruptible board members like Karen, and systematically drive out residents through harassment and intimidation. Karen was approached 18 months before she escalated against you, Detective Chen explained. Someone offered her $50,000 to create problems that would force at least 10 homeowners to sell their properties at reduced prices. The fake towing scheme targeting my truck hadn't been about HOA compliance at all. It had been a test run for a much larger operation designed to terrorize the entire neighborhood into fleeing. Agent Walsh showed me surveillance photos taken during Karen's arrest. In the background, barely visible, was a man in a dark sedan parked 3 blocks away, watching the entire confrontation through binoculars. "That's Vincent Carlucci," she said. "He's been running real estate fraud operations for 15 years. Karen was just his latest recruited asset." The FBI had been tracking Carlucci's network, but they needed evidence of direct criminal activity to make arrests. My documentation of Karen's fake towing operation, combined with Tommy's photographs and audio recordings, had provided the breakthrough they needed. "We want you to help us catch the rest of them," Agent Walsh said. The plan was both brilliant and terrifying. The FBI had identified 3 other HOA communities where Carlucci's people were in the early stages of recruitment. Board members were being approached with offers of money in exchange for creating compliance problems that would drive down property values. My role would be to move into one of those communities temporarily and become a target for their harassment. Morrison Recovery Services would set up operations to document everything, just like we'd done with Karen. But this time, we'd be working directly with federal agents to build a criminal case. "You'd be living undercover for up to 6 months, Agent Walsh explained. "We'd create a cover story about you expanding your business into the area. The goal is to get them to escalate their harassment to the point where we can arrest them for conspiracy, fraud, and racketeering." The target community was Riverside Oaks, a luxury development about 40 miles north of Meadowbrook Estates. The HOA president, a woman named Dorothy Blackwell, had recently started implementing aggressive new vehicle restrictions and architectural guidelines that seemed designed to create conflict with residents. FBI surveillance had observed Dorothy meeting with associates of Vincent Carlucci. Phone intercepts suggested that Riverside Oaks was being set up as the next target for their real estate manipulation scheme. I spent a week thinking about the FBI's proposal. Going undercover would mean leaving my house, my business operations, and my normal life for months. It would also mean putting myself in the crosshairs of criminals who were much more dangerous than Karen had been. But I kept thinking about all the families who had been forced out of their homes by this scheme. Elderly couples who had lost their life savings. Young families who had been terrorized into abandoning their dream homes. Kids who had been uprooted from their schools and neighborhoods because criminals wanted to steal their parents' equity. I called Agent Walsh on Friday morning. "When do we start?" The cover operation took 3 weeks to establish. The FBI created a legitimate-looking business expansion for Morrison Recovery Services, complete with rental agreements for garage space in Riverside Oaks and permits for operating commercial vehicles in the area. My cover story was perfect. I was a successful businessman looking to expand into a new market, wealthy enough to afford a house in Riverside Oaks, but blue-collar enough to drive trucks that would annoy snobbish HOA board members. I rented a house at 2247 Oak Valley Drive, directly across the street from Dorothy Blackwell's mansion. The FBI had equipped the rental with surveillance cameras and recording equipment that would document every interaction with the corrupt HOA leadership. On my first day in the neighborhood, I made sure to park my F-350 prominently in the driveway and spend the afternoon washing it while wearing my Morrison Recovery Services uniform. The psychological effect was immediate. Dorothy appeared at my property line within 2 hours, clipboard in hand, looking like Karen's slightly older and more sophisticated sister. She had the same predatory smile, the same aggressive posture, and the same obvious hunger for conflict. "You must be our new neighbor," she said with fake friendliness. "I'm Dorothy Blackwell, HOA president. I wanted to welcome you to Riverside Oaks and discuss some community standards that you'll need to be aware of." The script was almost identical to Karen's initial approach. Vehicle weight restrictions, architectural guidelines, noise ordinances, and a list of violations that basically added up to your truck bothers me, and I want it gone. But Dorothy was smarter than Karen had been. Instead of immediately threatening towing, she offered what seemed like a reasonable compromise. "I understand that your business requires specialized vehicles," she said. "The community has arrangements with several excellent commercial storage facilities nearby. We can even negotiate group rates for residents who need off-site parking." The storage facilities were almost certainly connected to Carlucci's network. Getting residents to pay for off-site storage was another way to extract money while making their lives more difficult. Over the next month, Dorothy's harassment followed the exact same escalation pattern that Karen had used. Photography surveillance, anonymous complaints to authorities, recruitment of other board members to support her campaign, and gradually increasing fines for minor violations. But Dorothy had learned from Karen's mistakes. Instead of hiring obvious criminals for fake enforcement, she brought in people who looked more legitimate. The security patrols had real uniforms and official-looking vehicles. The violation notices were professionally printed on letterhead that mimicked government documents. The FBI surveillance team was documenting everything, but we needed Dorothy to make the same kind of obvious criminal mistake that had brought down Karen. That opportunity came when Dorothy decided to escalate beyond vehicle harassment. 6 weeks into my undercover operation, I came home from a staged business meeting to find Dorothy and 2 men I didn't recognize standing in my backyard, taking photographs of my house with professional equipment. "Afternoon, Jake," Dorothy called out cheerfully. "Just conducting a routine architectural compliance survey. We've had some concerns about unauthorized modifications to your property." The 2 men with her weren't HOA board members. They looked like the kind of guys you'd hire when you needed something intimidating done quietly. One of them, a tall man with scarred hands and dead eyes, was photographing my electrical meter and air conditioning unit. The other, shorter but more muscular, was measuring the height of my fence and making notes on a clipboard. "What kind of modifications?" I asked, playing my role as a confused homeowner. Dorothy consulted her tablet with theatrical precision. "The landscaping appears to have been altered without architectural approval. The exterior lighting may not comply with community standards. And we have concerns about the structural integrity of your garage, given the weight of the vehicles you're storing there." None of these were legitimate concerns, and all of them were obviously pretexts for harassment. But Dorothy's 2 companions weren't there to discuss HOA violations. The tall one approached me with his clipboard. "Sir, we're going to need to conduct an interior inspection to assess potential structural damage caused by your commercial vehicle operations." That's when I realized Dorothy had made the same mistake Karen had made. She'd brought criminals into a legitimate dispute and was trying to use intimidation to force compliance. "I don't consent to any interior inspection," I said calmly. "If you have legitimate concerns about structural issues, you can file a complaint with the county building inspector." The shorter man stepped closer, invading my personal space. "This isn't a request, pal. The HOA has authority to inspect properties for compliance violations." That was a lie, and we all knew it. HOAs have no legal authority to conduct involuntary interior inspections of private homes. Dorothy was using fake authority backed by physical intimidation to gain access to my house. The FBI surveillance team was recording everything from multiple angles. Dorothy had just crossed the line from harassment into criminal trespass and conspiracy to commit burglary. "Ma'am," I said, addressing Dorothy directly, "I'm going to need you and your associates to leave my property immediately." Dorothy's mask of friendliness finally slipped. "You don't understand the situation you're in, Jake. This community has ways of dealing with residents who don't cooperate with reasonable requests." The threat was clear and recorded in high definition. Dorothy Blackwell had just committed criminal intimidation while trespassing on my property with two men who were obviously not legitimate HOA representatives. That evening, Agent Walsh called with an update from the surveillance team. "We got everything we needed. Dorothy's associates are Vincent Carlucci's enforcers. We've been trying to connect them to criminal activity for months." The arrests happened at dawn 3 days later. I was having coffee on my back deck, watching the sunrise over Riverside Oaks, when the FBI tactical teams moved in. Dorothy's house across the street was surrounded by agents in tactical gear, and I could see similar operations happening at houses throughout the neighborhood. Dorothy was arrested in her designer pajamas, screaming about violations of her constitutional rights, as agents carried boxes of evidence out of her house. The two enforcers who had tried to intimidate me were taken into custody at a hotel downtown, along with Vincent Carlucci himself. But the most satisfying arrest was at the storage facility Dorothy had recommended for residents with oversized vehicles. The FBI raid uncovered a massive operation involving stolen vehicles, fraudulent liens, and fake storage fees designed to separate residents from their cars. Dozens of vehicles that had been impounded from various HOA communities were found in the facility's backlots, some of them stripped for parts. Vincent Carlucci's real estate fraud network had stolen over $12 million from families across 12 states. The HOA corruption scheme was just one part of a criminal enterprise that included identity theft, mortgage fraud, and money laundering. The trial took 18 months to work through the federal court system. Carlucci was sentenced to 25 years in federal prison. Dorothy got 12 years for her role in the conspiracy. The two enforcers who had tried to intimidate me received sentences ranging from 8 to 15 years. But the most important outcome was the legislation that followed. The Carlucci investigation had exposed systematic flaws in HOA governance that made communities vulnerable to criminal infiltration. The Federal Trade Commission, working with state attorney generals, developed new regulations requiring background checks for HOA board members and mandatory financial audits for communities with more than 50 homes. The legislation was called the Homeowner Protection Act, but everyone involved in the investigation called it the Morrison Rules regulations designed to prevent the kind of criminal exploitation that had started with Karen threatening to tow my truck. Today, 5 years after that first confrontation with Karen in my driveway, Morrison Recovery Services has contracts with law enforcement agencies in 8 states to assist with HOA-related criminal investigations. We've helped expose corrupt board members, fake enforcement operations, and fraudulent contractor schemes in over 30 communities. My F-350 is still parked in my driveway every night, but now it's also a symbol of resistance against HOA corruption. I get calls from residents across the country who are dealing with harassment from power-hungry board members, and I always give them the same advice: document everything, know your rights, and never underestimate the importance of standing up to bullies. Because sometimes the person threatening to tow your truck is connected to a criminal network that's stealing from families across multiple states. And sometimes, one homeowner's refusal to be intimidated can bring down an entire criminal enterprise. Karen Morrison started this fight because she wanted to control her neighborhood's appearance. She ended up exposing a nationwide criminal conspiracy that had been operating for years. The moral of this story remains the same: be very careful who you threaten to tow. They might just own the trucks, the surveillance equipment, and the federal investigation, that brings down your entire criminal organization. Next week, I'll tell you about the Pine Valley HOA president who tried to ban military vehicles from her community and how she discovered that some fights you really don't want to pick with veterans who know how to organize resistance operations. But that's a story involving night vision goggles, tactical planning, and a community uprising that made national news.